What would you do if, in an instant, you lost everything that mattered to you? What if the person you trusted most turned into your greatest adversary? Could you ever imagine being caught in a battle for your own child's future, knowing that the outcome could change their life forever? For Sarah Miller, this was no longer a hypothetical question. It was her reality. As she sat in the courtroom, hands clenched tightly in her lap, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. The sterile smell of the courtroom, the cold marble floors, the hushed whispers of strangers, none of it mattered now. The only thing that mattered was the tiny figure standing beside her, Josh, her 10-year-old son. His eyes, wide and uncertain, flicked nervously between his parents and the judge. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. Her ex-husband, Mark, sat across from them, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the judge as if he were already celebrating a victory. He had hired the best lawyer money could buy, and he was determined to win. Full custody. He believed he could offer Josh a better life than she ever could. In his mind, Sarah was no longer fit to be the primary caregiver of their son. She had been too emotional, too unstable, too unreliable. But Sarah knew the truth. She had been a loving, devoted mother since the day Josh was born. She had spent sleepless nights, wiped away endless tears, and sacrificed her own happiness to ensure that Josh had everything he needed. The divorce hadn't been easy. No one ever said it would be, but Sarah had always put her son's well-being first. So why, then, was she fighting for her life in a courtroom, her parental rights on the line? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she took a slow, steady breath. She knew she had to stay strong. For Josh, for herself. She couldn't let Mark take him away. Not after everything they had been through together. The judge, a stern man with graying hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced at the papers in front of him before looking up at the room. "Ms. Miller," he began, his voice low but commanding. "We're here today to discuss the matter of custody of your son. Your ex-husband, Mr. Miller, has filed for full custody, citing concerns about your ability to provide a stable environment for Josh." Sarah's heart dropped. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. This wasn't how she imagined this would go. She had never imagined Mark would go this far. Across the room, Mark's lawyer, a slick man in a tailored suit, leaned forward, ready to make his case. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here because my client believes that Josh's best interests are not being served in his current living situation. Ms. Miller's emotional instability and lack of consistent parenting have created an environment that is not conducive to his well-being. Our request is clear. We believe Josh should be placed in the primary care of his father." Sarah's hands tightened around the edge of the chair. Emotional instability? Lack of consistent parenting? She wanted to stand up and shout, to tell them both how wrong they were. How much she loved Josh. How hard she had fought every single day to give him a stable life. But she couldn't. Not in that moment. The judge nodded and turned his gaze to Sarah. "Ms. Miller, do you have anything to say in response?" Her mind raced. What could she say? The words felt trapped inside her, heavy and suffocating. She had been preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say, but now, standing in the sterile courtroom, it all seemed so far away. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her response. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength with every word. "I am not perfect. I have made mistakes, just like anyone else. But I have always put Josh first. He is my world. I have been there for him through every hardship, every triumph. I've done everything in my power to give him a good life." She paused, trying to steady herself. "I know my ex-husband may not believe I'm fit to be his primary guardian, but I'm here today to prove that I am." Josh needs me. He always has. And I will fight for him. I won't let anyone take him away from me. The judge's eyes softened, just for a moment, but then he cleared his throat and returned to his professional demeanor. Thank you, Ms. Miller. The court will take your statement into consideration. Sarah sat back down, her heart racing. She had spoken from her heart, but she knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. The battle had only just begun. As the hearing continued, Sarah tried to focus on the proceedings, but her mind kept drifting back to Josh. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't know why his parents were fighting so bitterly over him. All he wanted was to feel safe, loved, and secure. But that safety was slipping away, and it was slipping away fast. Why is this happening, Mom? Josh had asked her the night before, his voice small, barely a whisper. I don't know, sweetie, she had replied, brushing the hair from his face. But I'm doing everything I can to make sure we stay together. And now, as she sat in that courtroom, watching her son's face contort with confusion and fear, she couldn't help but wonder, was she doing enough? As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom only grew. Sarah couldn't escape the gnawing sense of dread in her chest. What if the judge sided with Mark? What if he truly believed Sarah wasn't fit to care for Josh? But then, just as the judge was about to recess for the day, something happened that Sarah never could have anticipated. Josh stood up, his small hand clutching something tightly. Without a word, he walked up to the judge's bench and handed him a folded piece of paper. The room fell silent. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What was he doing? What was on that paper? The judge took the paper with a raised eyebrow, unfolding it slowly. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. And then, the judge looked up at Josh, his expression unreadable. Josh, the judge said in a voice that shook but was steady with conviction. It's for you, Your Honor, Josh said, his small voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. He looked up at the judge, his eyes filled with determination. It's what I want. The judge, clearly taken aback by the child's boldness, glanced at Sarah. She couldn't believe what was happening. Josh had never been one to step into the spotlight, never one to speak out loud about his feelings. And yet, here he was, standing in front of a courtroom full of strangers, giving the judge a letter, one that would change everything. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses, and looked back down at the letter. He read it silently, his face unreadable as he scanned the words Josh had written. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest. What could Josh have possibly written? After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally looked up, his voice soft and thoughtful. Your Honor, Josh began, his voice a little stronger now, I don't want to choose between my mom and dad. I love them both, but my mom, she's always been there for me. She's the one who's been there when I'm sad or scared or need someone to talk to. She's the one who helps me with my homework, who takes care of me when I'm sick, and who hugs me when I'm worried. I know she's been trying her best. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears as Josh spoke. She hadn't realized just how much he understood, how deeply he was aware of everything going on around him. For a moment, Sarah saw Josh as the strong, mature little boy he was becoming, rather than the child caught in the middle of a battle he never asked for. Josh hugged her back, his small arms wrapping around her neck as if to hold on to that promise. It wasn't just about the letter. It wasn't just about the courtroom. It was about the love they had, a bond so strong that it could never be broken. As they left the courtroom, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She had been through so much, but this moment Josh's courage had given her a newfound sense of strength. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she had hope. And that hope was something no one could take away from her. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? For Sarah, it was Josh. And no matter what happened next, she knew she would keep fighting for him, for their future, for their family. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sarah Miller had never envisioned her life, as it was now a life torn between two worlds. To the outside world, she appeared like any other mother, doing her best to raise her child in a chaotic world. But behind closed doors, her journey had been anything but typical. The story of how she arrived here in this battle for her son's future began long before the courtroom drama unfolded. Sarah's life had always been one of optimism, at least when she was young. She grew up in a small town in the Midwest, a place where everyone knew each other's business, but also a place where you could rely on your neighbors. Her family was close-knit, and Sarah's childhood was filled with summer evenings on the porch, the scent of fresh-cut grass, and laughter echoing through their old house. But even in this idyllic setting, Sarah's path wasn't entirely smooth. Her parents, though loving, had their own set of struggles. Her father, a mechanic, worked long hours to provide for the family, often missing out on family dinners and important moments. Her mother, a teacher, tried to balance her career with raising Sarah and her younger brother, Tom. The absence of her father's presence at home made Sarah feel like she was always striving for approval from both of her parents. She wanted to be the one to make them proud, to show them that despite their struggles, she could be someone great. But as a teenager, Sarah faced challenges of her own. She became aware of her parents' mounting financial struggles, and the cracks in her parents' relationships started to show. They fought frequently, mostly about money, but also about their roles in the family. Her mother became increasingly distant, while her father withdrew into his work. It was during this time that Sarah began to internalize the sense of not being enough no matter how hard she tried. At 18, Sarah made the decision to leave home. She took a scholarship to a local college, determined to make something of herself. It was a fresh start, a chance to escape the tension at home and pursue her own dreams. It was also where she met Mark. Mark was different from anyone Sarah had met before. He was confident, ambitious, and full of charm. He had big plans, and the way he talked about the future made Sarah believe he was someone who could help her escape the small-town life she had left behind. Their connection was instant, intense, and exciting. Soon after graduation, they married, and Sarah moved to the city to build a life with him. In those early days, things were good. Mark was a hard worker, driven by success. Sarah found a job as a marketing assistant, and the two of them spent their evenings dreaming of their future, a future they would build together. But as time went on, cracks began to show in their relationship. Mark's ambition took over his life, and his drive for success began to overshadow their connection. He became more consumed by his career, more absent in their relationship. Sarah, eager to start a family and create a home filled with the warmth she had grown up with, felt increasingly lonely. Their first child, Josh, was born 2 years into their marriage. Sarah was overjoyed at the idea of becoming a mother. She had always wanted a child, and the thought of having a little one to care for filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known. She hoped that having a baby would bring her and Mark closer together, but it only seemed to drive them further apart. While Sarah was focused on nurturing their son, Mark's work schedule grew longer, and his absence at home became more pronounced. He was never home for the sleepless nights, the midnight feedings, or the moments when Sarah felt the most overwhelmed. And despite her attempts to share her joys and struggles with him, Mark seemed more concerned with his next big deal than with being a partner and a father. The distance between them only grew. Sarah, once full of ambition and dreams, now found herself isolated and questioning her choices. But she had Josh, and that love was her anchor. He was the light of her life, her purpose, the reason she kept going when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Over the years, Sarah began to realize that she was living in a marriage that was falling apart. She tried to hold on, tried to make things work for the sake of their family, but Mark became more distant. Arguments became more frequent, and the tension in the house was palpable. Sarah started to feel like she was raising Josh alone, emotionally unsupported by her husband. Eventually, after months of trying to salvage their marriage, Sarah made the painful decision to leave Mark. The divorce was inevitable. She knew it, Mark knew it, and Josh, even though he was too young to fully understand, could feel the shift in the air. The split was difficult, both emotionally and financially, but Sarah was resolute. She had to protect Josh, she had to create a stable environment for him, one that Mark had stopped being able to provide. The divorce process was exhausting. Sarah fought to maintain custody of Josh, knowing that Mark had more resources and was in a better position to get what he wanted. At first, it seemed like the court would be on her side. After all, she was the primary caregiver, the one who had always been there for Josh. But Mark's lawyer was aggressive, using Sarah's emotional vulnerabilities against her, painting her as unstable and unreliable. It was during the long, drawn-out battle that Sarah realized just how much power the system had and how much it could be twisted by those with the right connections. Yet, through it all, Sarah's love for Josh remained her guiding star. She was not the perfect mother. She had made mistakes, as every parent does, but she was doing the best she could. Her bond with Josh was unshakable, and she was determined to prove that she could give him the stable, loving home he deserved. Mark's demands for full custody didn't surprise her, but they devastated her. After all, this wasn't just a battle for parental rights. It was a battle for her son. And it was a fight she wasn't prepared to lose. As Sarah sat in her car later that night, reflecting on the court hearing, she couldn't help but wonder about the future. She had fought tooth and nail to create a stable, loving home for Josh, but the emotional toll it had taken on her was undeniable. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on her chest. What would happen if the judge decided in Mark's favor? Could she survive losing her son? Her thoughts were interrupted as Josh's small voice cut through the quiet of the car. "Mom?" Josh asked from the back seat. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" Sarah smiled softly, her heart aching for him. He didn't deserve this. But she would make sure that no matter what happened, he would know that his mom would never stop fighting for him. "Yes, sweetie," she replied, her voice filled with determination. "We're going to be okay. We'll always be okay." It was that promise, that unwavering belief, that kept her going. Because even in the face of everything she had lost, Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would never stop fighting for Josh. The days following the courtroom hearing were filled with an undercurrent of tension that Sarah could feel gnawing at her. Mark had not said a word to her since that fateful day in the courtroom. But she knew he was furious. The last thing he had expected was Josh, their son, standing up and making his own declaration. It was a move that caught him off guard, and Sarah could almost feel the anger radiating off him. The stakes were higher than ever, and there was no turning back now. Sarah's phone rang early the next morning as she sat in her small kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee. The sound jolted her from her thoughts, and she quickly picked up the receiver, bracing herself for whatever news was about to come her way. "Sarah," it was Mark's voice on the other end of the line. It sounded tight, controlled, the kind of voice someone uses when they're trying not to lose their temper. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. The last thing she wanted to do was speak to Mark, especially after everything that had happened. But she knew it was inevitable. The custody battle was only just beginning, and both of them would have to face each other in ways they hadn't yet. "Okay," she replied cautiously, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want to talk about?" Mark's sigh was audible on the line. "I'm not going to let you in this, Sarah," he said, the words coming out almost as a warning. "I'm going to get full custody of Josh. You're not fit to raise him on your own." Sarah's grip tightened around her coffee mug. She could feel the sting of his words, the sharpness of his accusation, but she refused to let him see how much it hurt. "I'm his mother, Mark," Sarah said firmly. I've been his mother every single day of his life. You can't just take him from me because you think you can. Mark didn't respond right away. There was a long pause, one that stretched long enough for Sarah to feel the weight of his anger behind the silence. Finally, he spoke again, his voice colder than before. You're emotionally unstable, Sarah. The court will see that. You're too emotional. I'm not going to let you drag Josh into your drama. He needs stability, not your whatever this is. His words stung, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Sarah knew he was playing on her vulnerabilities. He knew exactly how to hit her where it hurt, and he was trying to manipulate the situation to his advantage. But she wasn't going to let him win. Not when Josh needed her the most. Mark, don't you dare talk about stability, Sarah spat, her voice sharp. You're never home. You've never been the one there when Josh needed someone. You've always chosen your career over your family, and now you want to play the martyr. Mark's tone turned angry now, his voice rising. You think you're better than me? You think you've got all the answers? I'm providing for Josh, Sarah. What do? You stay home, you wallow in self-pity, and you think that makes you a better mother. The accusation hit like a slap, but Sarah wasn't going to let him tear her down. She was stronger than he gave her credit for. I don't need you to tell me how to be a mother, she said through gritted teeth. I've given Josh everything, and I will keep giving him everything he needs. You're right about one thing, he does need stability. And that's exactly what I'm giving him. Mark was silent for a moment, and Sarah could almost hear him pacing on the other end of the line, trying to control his anger. She knew he wasn't done yet, but she wasn't about to back down. Finally, Mark spoke again, this time his voice low, but dangerous. This isn't over, Sarah. Not by a long shot. You're going to regret this. And with that, the line went dead. The words echoed in her mind long after the call ended. You're going to regret this. Mark's threat wasn't idle. He was going to fight for Josh with everything he had. And she knew that meant things were only going to get uglier from here on out. The next few days felt like a slow-moving storm on the horizon, the quiet before the chaos hit. Sarah kept herself busy, focusing on work and taking care of Josh. But every now and then, she would catch herself wondering what Mark was planning. Was he already working with his lawyer to find a way to undermine her? Was he gathering evidence against her, preparing for the next round of the fight? It wasn't just about Josh anymore. It had become a battle for control. Who would win? Who would lose? Who would be in charge of their son's future? Josh had noticed the tension too, although he didn't fully understand it. He would ask questions Sarah wasn't ready to answer, at least not in full. But she didn't want to lie to him either. She wanted him to feel safe, to feel secure, even if everything around him was in turmoil. Mom, Josh said one evening as they sat down for dinner. What's going to happen? Is Dad really going to take me away from you? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah couldn't speak. How could she explain the mess of grown-up emotions to a 10-year-old boy who just wanted to feel safe? No, Josh, she finally said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. Your dad can't take you from me. I'm not going to let that happen. Josh nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced. And how could he be? He'd seen the way his father had been acting, the way the arguments between his parents had escalated. He was caught in the middle of a war he didn't understand. I'm scared, Mom, Josh admitted quietly, his voice small. I don't want to choose between you and Dad. Sarah's heart ached for him. She knew what it was like to be caught in the middle, but she couldn't let him feel like he had to bear that weight. I know, sweetie, she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. But you don't have to choose. We'll figure this out, okay? No matter what, you and I are in this together. And I promise you, we're going to be okay. But in that moment, Sarah wasn't so sure. The storm was coming, and it was going to be worse than she ever imagined. The battle for Josh's future had only just begun, and the conflict between her and Mark was about to reach new heights. The road ahead was uncertain, and Sarah had no idea how far Mark was willing to go to win. But she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. It had been a week since the phone call with Mark, and Sarah could feel the tension in her body creeping up higher with each passing day. Her mornings were filled with the frantic scramble of getting Josh ready for school, packing lunches, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for him. But the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. The fear of what might come next hovered over her like a cloud, one she couldn't shake. Every glance at her phone, every email from her lawyer, every passing comment from a friend made the looming battle feel more real. But amidst the growing uncertainty, something unexpected began to happen. Sarah realized that this wasn't just about the custody battle, it was about reclaiming her life. The act of fighting for her son had ignited something inside of her. She wasn't just going to be a passive player in this game. She was going to take control. Sarah had always been the type to bottle things up, to push through the tough moments and pretend everything was fine. But the custody hearing had cracked that facade wide open. She had been vulnerable, raw, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to pretend. She was a mother fighting for her son's future, and she wasn't going to back down. After the call from Mark, Sarah had spent hours researching the ins and outs of custody cases. She contacted a lawyer specializing in family law, someone who had a reputation for being tough but fair. After an initial consultation, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her lawyer, Eleanor, was confident. She assured Sarah that the fact Josh had spoken up in court, that he had chosen her, would be a significant factor in the case. Still, Eleanor warned her that the road ahead was going to be difficult. Mark had resources. He had the money to hire the best legal team, and he was determined to win at any cost. It was during one of their meetings that Eleanor made a suggestion that Sarah hadn't considered before. "Sarah, I think it's time we start preparing Josh. He's going to be a key witness in this case, and the more he understands what's at stake, the better we can support him," Eleanor said, her voice calm but resolute. Sarah hesitated. The thought of putting Josh through more emotional turmoil was unbearable. He was just a child. He didn't deserve to carry this weight. "I don't know if he's ready for that," Sarah said softly, her heart aching at the thought. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "I understand your hesitation. But you need to prepare him. He needs to know that his voice matters, that he has a say in what happens next. You're not alone in this fight, Sarah. You have Josh on your side." That evening, Sarah sat down with Josh on the couch. She could see the concern in his eyes. He had always been a sensitive child, perceptive to the undercurrents in their home. He knew something was wrong. He had seen his mother's tears, heard the sharpness in Mark's voice during their arguments, and sensed the growing divide between his parents. "Mom, are you really going to be okay?" Josh asked, his voice quiet. Sarah put her arm around him, pulling him close. Her heart swelled with love and protectiveness for this boy who had been her constant in all the chaos. She didn't want him to worry any more than he already had. "We're going to be okay, Josh," she reassured him, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm going to fight for you. And I want you to know that your opinion matters. I need you to trust me." Josh looked up at her, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "What do you mean? What's going to happen?" Sarah took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "There's going to be a lot of talk about what's best for you. But I need you to know that what matters most is what you want. You're old enough to have a say in this, and your voice is important." Josh furrowed his brow, confusion clouding his features. "But what if Dad says I should live with him? What if he says I don't have a choice?" Sarah felt a pang in her chest. She had hoped this moment would never come, but here it was. She had to prepare him for what might be ahead. "Josh, listen to me," she said gently, looking into his eyes. "You don't have to choose between your dad and me. This isn't about picking sides. It's about making sure you're safe and happy and that you feel loved by both of us." Josh nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the worry in his eyes. The weight of the situation was slowly sinking in, and she hated that he had to carry it. But at the same time, she knew this was a crucial moment for him, for both of them. "Mom, I don't want to hurt anyone," Josh admitted, his voice small. "You won't," Sarah replied, her voice filled with conviction. "No matter what happens, you won't hurt anyone. You're telling the truth, and that's all that matters." The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and phone calls. Mark's lawyer had filed a motion for full custody, citing Sarah's emotional instability as a reason why she wasn't fit to care for Josh. It was a low blow, but Sarah knew it was coming. It didn't matter to Mark that he had barely been involved in their son's life for the past few years. He was going to fight dirty, and he was going to use every tool at his disposal. Sarah kept her focus on Josh, determined to shield him as much as possible. She spent evenings with him, talking about his feelings and making sure he felt supported. But there were moments when she saw the cracks beginning to show. Josh was quieter than usual, and Sarah noticed he wasn't sleeping well. He had begun to ask questions she wasn't sure how to answer. His trust in the system, in the people around him, was starting to falter. One afternoon, as they sat at the kitchen table, Josh asked, "Mom, will I still be able to see Dad if I stay with you?" Sarah's heart broke at the innocence in his voice. "Of course, sweetheart. You'll still see your dad. Nothing will change that." Josh nodded, but Sarah could see that the answer didn't bring him peace. He was so much more mature than he should have been, forced to process adult problems long before he was ready. She wanted to shield him from all of this, but the reality was, there was no escaping it. This was their fight now, and it was going to take everything she had. The road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She was ready to face whatever came next. She would fight for Josh with every ounce of strength she had, no matter what. The day of the next court hearing arrived faster than Sarah had anticipated. It felt as though the days had blurred together into a chaotic mess of legal jargon, meetings with her lawyer, and trying to maintain some semblance of normal life for Josh. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sarah could feel the knot in her stomach tighten with each step she took toward the courthouse. It was like walking into battle, unsure of what the outcome would be, but knowing that every word, every gesture would be scrutinized. As she stood in front of the courthouse, waiting for her lawyer, Eleanor, to arrive, Sarah's thoughts were consumed by one thing: Josh. The stakes had never been higher. This wasn't just about custody anymore. This was about his future, about whether he would grow up feeling torn between two parents who loved him but couldn't coexist peacefully. It was about whether he would feel secure, whether he would have the stability he needed to thrive. Josh had been nervous for days, and it broke Sarah's heart. She had tried to reassure him, telling him that he wasn't alone in this, that she was there for him no matter what. But she could see the weight of it all on his small shoulders. The fact that he would have to testify, to stand in front of the judge and make a decision that could change everything, was something Sarah wished she could shield him from. "Mom," Josh had said the night before, his voice trembling, "what if I say the wrong thing? What if Dad gets mad at me?" Her heart had shattered at the vulnerability in his voice. She had pulled him close, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Josh, you don't have to worry about what anyone else thinks. Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do." But even as she said those words, Sarah wasn't entirely sure what the truth would bring. What if Josh chose Mark? What if the court ruled in Mark's favor? The fear of losing him, of not being enough, was a constant ache in her chest. Inside the courthouse, Sarah and Eleanor were ushered into the courtroom. Mark was already there, sitting on the other side with his lawyer. His face was tight, his jaw clenched in that familiar way that made Sarah feel like she was standing across from a stranger. They had once been partners, a team in raising Josh. Now they were adversaries, and it was as if the years of their marriage had evaporated in a single moment. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The proceedings began, and Sarah could feel the intensity mounting. Her hands were clammy, her heart racing. The tension was almost unbearable. "Sarah," Eleanor whispered, squeezing her hand. "Remember, you're doing this for Josh. Stay calm and focus. The truth is on your side." Sarah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The weight of the situation was crushing, and she could hardly breathe, let alone think clearly. When it was her turn to speak, her voice came out shaky, but she steadied herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I've been Josh's mother his whole life. I've done everything I can to provide for him, to love him, to protect him. And I'm asking the court to understand that he deserves to stay with me. He deserves stability, and I am the one who can provide that for him." She felt Mark's gaze on her, cold and unyielding. He was watching, waiting for her to falter. But Sarah wouldn't. She couldn't. Not when Josh needed her. The moment came when Josh was called to testify. Sarah's heart clenched as she watched him walk into the courtroom, his small frame looking so out of place in such a grand, intimidating room. He was dressed in his best shirt and pants, his shoes shiny and new. He looked so much older than his 10 years, and Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. The judge nodded at him kindly, but Sarah could see how nervous Josh was. He kept fidgeting with his hands, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, looking over at Sarah every now and then for reassurance. "Josh," the judge began, his voice calm and soothing, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell me what you want. Do you feel comfortable living with your mother, or do you want to live with your father?" Josh's eyes flickered toward Sarah, and Sarah gave him a small, encouraging smile. But inside, she was a whirlwind of emotions. What would he say? What was going through his mind? The fear of losing him was a gnawing ache in her chest, but she knew that no matter what, she had to trust him. Josh took a deep breath, his small voice barely audible at first. I want to live with my mom. I feel safe with her." There it was. The moment Sarah had been dreading, the moment that would determine everything. Her heart soared, but the relief was short-lived. She knew the battle wasn't over. Mark was still going to fight. He wasn't going to give up easily. But in that moment, Sarah realized something. Josh had spoken his truth. He had made his choice. And no matter what happened next, that was something she could hold on to. Mark's lawyer jumped up immediately, cross-examining Josh with a barrage of questions meant to undermine his testimony. She asked him if he was sure, if he understood the consequences of his words, if he was under pressure from his mother. Sarah held her breath as Josh flinched under the barrage of questions. He wasn't used to this. No child should ever be put in this position. "Josh," the lawyer asked, her voice sharp, "are you sure you want to stay with your mother? Doesn't your father have a right to take care of you?" Josh's lip trembled, and Sarah could see the doubt creep into his expression. She wanted to rush to him, to protect him from this, but she knew she couldn't. He had to face this himself. I want to stay with my mom," Josh said again, more firmly this time. "She takes care of me. She makes me feel safe." Sarah's heart swelled with pride. She knew he was scared, but he was speaking from his heart. And that was all she could ask for. The courtroom fell silent after Josh's testimony. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah could feel the tide turning in their favor. But it wasn't over yet. Mark wasn't going to give up without a fight. The next few hours felt like an eternity. The lawyers presented their closing arguments, and Sarah could feel herself starting to crumble under the pressure. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but she couldn't allow herself to give up now. Not when Josh needed her more than ever. The judge announced that he would make his ruling in a few days, but the battle had already taken its toll. Sarah left the courtroom with Eleanor by her side, her mind spinning, her body exhausted. But as she walked out into the sunlight, she realized something that she hadn't fully understood before. No matter what happened in the end, she had done everything she could for Josh. She had fought for him. And she had won. The following days were a blur. Sarah barely slept, her mind constantly replaying the events of the hearing. Each moment felt like a roller coaster ride, a mix of hope, fear, and uncertainty. The weight of the decision that would soon come felt impossible to bear, and yet, in the quiet moments, she found a strange sense of peace. She had done everything she could to fight for Josh. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and given him the one thing she could offer, her unwavering love and commitment. The ruling from the judge finally arrived, and Sarah sat in her living room with Josh by her side, holding her breath. Eleanor had promised to call her as soon as the decision was made, but the wait felt like an eternity. The phone rang late one evening, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Hello," she answered, her voice tight. "Sarah, it's Eleanor. I have the judge's ruling." Sarah's heart raced. She motioned for Josh to come sit next to her, taking his hand in hers. Josh looked at her with wide eyes, sensing the tension in the air. "Is it good news?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor paused for a moment before replying, and it was in that brief silence that Sarah felt every moment of fear and hope rush to the surface. "Sarah, the judge has ruled in your favor. Full custody of Josh has been awarded to you." The words felt like a weight lifting off Sarah's shoulders. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She glanced down at Josh, whose eyes had filled with tears of relief. He didn't need to say anything, his expression said it all. In that moment, Sarah knew that this battle, this fight for their family, had been worth every sleepless night, every tear shed, every moment of uncertainty. "Thank you, Eleanor," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much. You did the hard work, Sarah," Eleanor replied warmly. "You fought for Josh. And you won." As soon as Sarah hung up the phone, Josh threw his arms around her, hugging her tight. She could feel his small body shaking, the emotion of the moment finally catching up to him. "We won, Mom," Josh whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We really won." Sarah's heart swelled as she held him close, tears welling up in her own eyes. It wasn't just about winning in court, it was about everything they had been through together. It was about their bond, their love, their resilience. "We did, baby," Sarah said softly, brushing his hair back from his face. "We did." The next few weeks were filled with a mixture of celebration and quiet reflection. Sarah and Josh spent more time together, soaking in the relief of knowing that their future was secure. They visited the places they loved, taking long walks in the park, visiting the local bookstore, and spending lazy afternoons baking cookies. Life began to settle back into a routine, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to breathe again. But there was something more important than just settling into a new normal. Sarah had learned something vital in the course of this battle. She had rediscovered her own strength. In the face of overwhelming odds, she had found the courage to fight. It wasn't just the legal battle that mattered, it was the personal one. She had found her voice, her power, and she realized that no matter what the world threw at her, she could handle it. She could protect her son. She could stand tall. She thought often about the day Josh had testified, about how scared he had been, how vulnerable, and yet how brave. His words had been simple, but they had carried the weight of his truth. And that truth, his truth, had been what had changed everything. He hadn't just spoken for himself, but for the life they had built together. It was clear to Sarah that this battle hadn't just been about the custody of a child. It had been about building a future, one that was grounded in love, trust, and honesty. It had been about learning how to fight for what truly mattered and how to stand up for the ones we love, no matter what. One evening, as Sarah sat down to dinner with Josh, she looked at him and smiled. There was something about his laugh, the way he talked about his day, that made her realize how much he had grown. This process, this fight, had not only shaped her as a mother but had shaped Josh too. He was stronger now, more self-assured. He had learned, just as she had, that sometimes the most difficult battles lead to the most meaningful victories. "Mom," Josh said, breaking into her thoughts. Do you think everything will be okay now? Sarah smiled softly, her heart full. She reached across the table and took his hand. I think it already is, sweetie. I think we're going to be just fine. Josh grinned, his eyes sparkling. Me too. Life was far from perfect, and Sarah knew there would still be challenges ahead. But in that moment, she realized that everything she had fought for, the sleepless nights, the tears, the tension, had been worth it. Because in the end, what mattered most was that they had each other. And that was all she needed. The weeks following the custody hearing were anything but peaceful. While Sarah had been awarded full custody of Josh, Mark's reaction was far from understanding or accepting. He may not have gotten what he wanted in court, but that didn't stop him from continuing his fight in more subtle, but damaging ways. And for Sarah, the emotional toll of this ongoing conflict was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Mark's new strategy was one of manipulation. It wasn't the aggressive legal tactics he had once used, but something far more insidious, using Josh as a pawn in his own quest for control. Sarah had seen it before, when they were married. How Mark could turn on the charm, twist words, and plant seeds of doubt in others. But now he was doing the same thing with their son. Josh, for his part, wasn't as naive as Mark seemed to think. He had grown up in a world of conflict between his parents and had witnessed his fair share of arguments and emotional games. But the damage Mark was doing now felt different. It wasn't about blatant insults or yelling. No, Mark had learned how to speak to Josh in a way that made him question his reality. It started with small, casual comments whenever Josh went over to Mark's house. I really don't know why your mom is so determined to keep you away from me, Mark would say, his tone laced with mock sadness. She's always been so selfish, Josh. You know that, right? The first few times, Josh didn't know how to respond. He was caught off guard by his father's words, unsure of how to process them. After all, it wasn't like Sarah had ever kept him from his father. But as the weeks went on, the comments became more frequent, more pointed, and more hurtful. Mark would ask Josh, in a seemingly innocent tone, "Do you really think your mom wants what's best for you? Or is she just trying to keep you all to herself?" Josh, in his quiet, contemplative way, began to internalize these questions. And it was showing. He started becoming distant, not only from Mark, but from Sarah as well. When she would ask him about his time with his dad, his answers were short and evasive. It wasn't just that he was starting to believe his father's words, it was that he was starting to doubt his own feelings. He didn't know how to reconcile the man who had just tried to tear his family apart with the one who had once been his hero. For Sarah, it was a painful experience. She could see the shift in Josh, but every attempt to talk about it was met with resistance. He pulled away, emotionally, and that was the hardest part. The mother-son bond that had been so strong for years was now fraying at the edges. She began to notice little things, how Josh would seem sad after a visit to Mark's house, how he would lose himself in his video games or his books, unable or unwilling to talk. Sarah knew her son. She could read him like a book. But what was worse was that Josh was now acting like he was trapped between two worlds, his father's manipulative version of events, and the truth that Sarah had always tried to instill in him, that love and honesty were the only things that really mattered. One night, Sarah confronted Josh about his behavior. "Josh," she began gently, sitting beside him on the couch. "I've noticed that you've been acting different lately. You've been distant. Is something going on? You know you can talk to me, right?" Josh didn't meet her eyes. He stared at the TV screen, even though the show was long over. His fingers fidgeted with the remote control, twisting it in his hands. "I'm fine, Mom," he mumbled. "Just tired." Sarah could tell that wasn't the truth. She could tell when Josh was holding back, and this time, it was worse than before. "Josh, sweetheart," she said, softly placing her hand on his, "I know you're not fine. And I know you've been spending a lot of time with your dad. If something's bothering you, we can talk about it." Josh was silent for a long moment, and then, In a quiet voice that broke Sarah's heart, he said, "Sometimes, Dad says things that make me think. Maybe you don't want me. Maybe you just want me to stay with you because you don't want me to see him." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She wanted to deny them, to say that Mark was lying, that it was all just part of his plan to make her look bad. But in that moment, she realized that Josh wasn't just repeating things he'd heard from his father. He truly believed them, or at least, he was starting to. "Oh, Josh," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I want you more than anything in this world. I want you to be happy and safe, and I'll always want what's best for you. I'm not trying to keep you from your dad, but I do want you to know that it's okay to love both of us. It doesn't mean you have to choose." Josh's eyes flickered with confusion, a mix of emotions battling inside of him. "But why does Dad keep saying that? Why does he make me feel like you're trying to take me away from him?" Sarah took a deep breath. She knew this was a conversation she never wanted to have, but it was one she had to have, for Josh's sake. "Sweetheart," Sarah began, her voice soft but steady. "Your dad and we've been through a lot. We both want to be with you, and sometimes, when people are hurt or angry, they say things that aren't true. I'm not trying to keep you from him, and I'm definitely not trying to make you choose. But sometimes, your dad doesn't always say the right things. And that's something you'll have to figure out for yourself." Josh's gaze dropped to his hands, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might burst into tears. Instead, he just nodded quietly, as if trying to process everything. "I'll try to understand, Mom," he said softly. "But it's hard. I don't want to make anyone mad." "I know, honey," Sarah said, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "It's hard for me too. But I promise, we'll get through this. You don't have to carry the weight of this on your shoulders. We're in this together." As Josh went to bed that night, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't just fighting Mark in court anymore. She was fighting for her son's emotional well-being, trying to preserve his trust, his sense of self, and the bond they had once shared. And that fight was one that she wasn't sure she could win alone. But she had to try. The days after the conversation with Josh felt like they were dragging on endlessly. Sarah could sense the growing distance between her and her son, and it weighed heavily on her heart. Despite her best efforts to reassure him, the questions lingered in his eyes, the doubt in his words. He wasn't the same boy he had been before all of this, before the custody battle, before the emotional games Mark had begun playing. The Josh she had known had always been warm, open, and unafraid to share his thoughts. Now he seemed distant, caught between two worlds he didn't know how to navigate. It wasn't until one cold, crisp morning that things took a surprising turn. "Mom," Josh said, his voice shaky but firm. "I want to speak in court. I want to tell the judge what I think." Sarah froze, her heart skipping a beat. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. Did her son really just say that? She turned toward him, trying to hide the shock in her expression. "Josh, are you sure? This is a big decision, and I don't want you to feel pressured by anyone, not by me, not by your dad." Josh met her gaze, his eyes filled with an intensity she had rarely seen before. "I know, but I want to. I need to. I have to let the judge know how I feel. I'm not a little kid anymore, Mom. I don't want to just be caught in the middle anymore." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. She had always encouraged Josh to be honest, to voice his feelings, but this was different. The thought of her son stepping up in court, voicing his emotions in front of everyone, especially after everything that had happened, was terrifying. What if it made things worse? What if Mark twisted his words, turned the court against them? But then she saw the determination in his eyes, the quiet strength he was trying to muster. Sarah knew she had to support him, even if it scared her. She had spent so much of her life protecting Josh, but now it seemed he was taking control of his own story. "I'll support you, Josh," she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "But you have to know this might not be easy. It might be hard. Are you ready for that?" Josh nodded, his face set with resolve. I am, Mom. I need to do this. For me. Sarah hugged him tightly, her heart swelling with pride and fear all at once. She knew this was a pivotal moment in Josh's life. It was a moment of courage, of taking control of his own narrative. But it was also a moment of vulnerability. The courtroom would be an unforgiving place, and she couldn't protect him from everything. All she could do was stand beside him, no matter what happened. The days leading up to the court hearing felt like an eternity. The air in the house was thick with tension, both from Sarah's internal struggles and Josh's quiet determination. He spent his nights writing, scribbling furiously in his journal as he tried to find the right words to say. Sometimes he would come to Sarah, showing her a sentence or two. Other times he would retreat into his room, closing the door behind him. Sarah didn't push him. She knew this was something he had to work through on his own. When the day finally arrived, Sarah found herself unable to sleep the night before. She kept replaying the conversation they had in her mind, wondering if she had made the right choice by allowing Josh to speak. There was no way to predict how this would unfold. She could only hope that Josh's voice, his truth, would be enough to cut through the noise and the manipulation. The courtroom was even more imposing than Sarah had remembered. It felt colder somehow, even though she had been here before. The walls seemed to close in around her as she sat beside Josh, her hand on his shoulder. She could feel the weight of his nerves, even though he was trying so hard to keep his composure. His eyes were wide, and his hands trembled slightly in his lap. Sarah tried to steady her own breathing, knowing that if she let the anxiety overwhelm her, it would only make things worse. Mark was already seated on the other side of the room, his lawyer beside him. Sarah couldn't help but notice how smug he looked, how sure of himself. It was as if he thought he was already winning. But she wouldn't let his presence shake her. She focused on Josh, her son, and the fact that this was his moment to speak for himself. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the room to order. The air was thick with anticipation. Sarah could feel the tension building, could hear the rustle of papers and the shuffle of feet as everyone settled into place. Mr. Richards, the judge said, addressing Mark's lawyer. We understand that your client would like to present his case for full custody. But before we proceed, it seems that Josh has something to say. At the mention of his name, Josh tensed beside Sarah. But then he took a deep breath, his small hand finding hers in a quiet gesture of reassurance. The judge turned her attention to Josh. Josh, you may speak now if you wish. Josh stood up slowly, his legs shaking slightly beneath him. Sarah's heart ached at the sight of him, so small, so brave, standing in front of a room full of strangers. But then he took another deep breath, and with quiet determination, he stepped forward. I want to say something, Josh began, his voice unsteady at first, but growing firmer with each word. I know everyone thinks I'm just a kid, and maybe I don't know everything, but I know that I love both my parents, and I know that I want to be with my mom. She's always been there for me. Even when things were hard, she never gave up on me. And I don't think she's trying to take me away from my dad. She just wants me to be safe. And I want to be with her. The room was eerily silent. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, seeing the shock on the faces of everyone present. But the most important thing was the look in Josh's eyes. He was speaking his truth. This was his moment. As Josh reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded letter, Sarah felt her stomach twist. He had written it himself. She didn't know what it said, but she could tell it was important. Josh handed the letter to the judge, his hands trembling as he did. The judge unfolded it carefully, reading the simple words written inside. It was just a few sentences, but they spoke volumes. I love my mom. She is the best. I want to stay with her because I feel safe with her. I don't want to be stuck in the middle anymore. Please help me stay with her. There was no grand speech, no elaborate arguments. Just a raw, honest plea from a boy who simply wanted to be heard. The judge paused, visibly moved. Sarah could see her own emotions reflected in the judge's eyes. For a moment, the world outside that courtroom seemed to disappear. It was just Josh's words and the truth they carried. The silence in the courtroom was palpable. The only sound was the rustling of paper as the judge read Josh's letter. Sarah's heart raced as she tried to process the gravity of the moment. Josh had just spoken his truth, and now the courtroom hung on the delicate balance between his words and the power of his emotions. The judge slowly raised her gaze from the letter, locking eyes with Sarah. There was an unspoken understanding in that moment, a connection that felt almost tangible. The judge had seen the pain and the strength in Josh's words. But now it was up to her to decide whether those words would carry weight in the face of the law. Josh stood in front of the judge, his small shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched him, standing taller than he had in years, his voice shaking but resolute. She wanted to rush forward, to hold him close and shield him from all the harsh realities of the world, but she knew this was his fight, his moment. And he was fighting for what mattered most. Josh's voice broke the silence once more. "I don't want to feel like I have to pick between my parents," he said, his words filled with the raw honesty of a child who had already seen too much. "I just want to be with my mom. I want to feel safe. She's always been there for me. And I don't think that's too much to ask for." Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek, though she tried to hide it. Josh had always been strong, but this was something she never expected. To hear him stand up, to hear him express his pain so clearly, so honestly, was overwhelming. She had spent years shielding him from the worst of it, but in this moment, he was taking control of his own story. The judge took a deep breath and placed the letter on the bench in front of her, her face softening. "Thank you, Josh," she said quietly. "Your words are powerful. It's clear to me that you've thought long and hard about this." Sarah could feel her pulse quicken. Would this be enough? Would the judge see Josh's plea for what it was, a genuine desire to stay with his mother, the one person who had never wavered, even when things were at their darkest? For a moment, the room was still. The tension between Sarah and Mark was thick, as if everything had come down to this one defining moment. Mark, who had once been so sure of himself, now looked uneasy, his face tight with frustration. He had never anticipated that Josh would speak out, let alone in such a powerful way. The judge turned her attention to Mark, her expression neutral. "Mr. Richards, it is clear that your son has expressed his preference to remain with his mother. While I acknowledge the importance of maintaining relationships with both parents, I also have a duty to consider what is in the best interest of the child." Mark's lawyer immediately sprang to his feet, his voice sharp and insistent. "Your Honor, while we respect Josh's wishes, we believe that Mr. Richards has a right to be a part of his son's life. The situation between Mr. Richards and Mrs. Richards is complex, but that should not deprive Josh of the opportunity to have both parents actively involved." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Sarah could feel her own chest tightening as she prepared for the inevitable back and forth that was about to ensue. She had never fully realized just how much power words could have in a courtroom, how easily they could be twisted, manipulated. She had spent so long protecting Josh from the harshness of their reality, but now she had to trust that his voice, his untainted, pure voice, would be enough to cut through it all. The judge, however, was not easily swayed. "Mr. Richards, I understand your concerns, but we cannot ignore what Josh has said. His emotional well-being is paramount here. I will take all factors into consideration, but I cannot ignore the powerful plea he has made today." The air seemed to shift in that moment. Sarah's stomach did a flip as she watched Mark, his face contorted with frustration, but unable to do anything but sit there in silence. For the first time, it seemed like the tide was turning in her favor. Later that afternoon, the courtroom was adjourned, but the tension lingered in the air like a thick fog. Josh had returned to Sarah's side, his hand finding hers again as they walked out together. He hadn't said much after his testimony, but Sarah could tell he was processing everything in his own way. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked softly, squeezing his hand as they walked out of the courtroom. Josh nodded, but his eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Yeah, I think I said what I needed to say. I don't know what's going to happen now." Sarah's heart ached for him. He was so young, yet he had already shouldered so much. She knew this battle was far from over, but seeing him speak up like that, hearing him use his voice to fight for what he wanted, it made her proud. It made her believe, for the first time in months, that maybe, just maybe, they could come out of this on top. The drive home was quiet. Sarah's mind was racing, replaying the events in the courtroom over and over again. She kept wondering if there was something more she could have done, something she could have said, but then she remembered Josh's words, the way he had stood up, the strength he had shown. That was enough. He had done the hard part. All she had to do now was trust the process and trust that they had done the right thing. When they arrived home, Josh went straight to his room, and Sarah, for the first time in a long while, allowed herself to sit in silence. She didn't want to get her hopes up, but something inside her told her that today had been different. Josh had spoken from the heart, and no amount of manipulation or legal strategy could take that away. She couldn't protect Josh from everything, but today, she had witnessed him take a powerful step toward controlling his own destiny. And no matter how this battle ended, that was a victory in itself. The days following Josh's testimony were filled with tension. Sarah found it difficult to sleep, her thoughts racing as she replayed every moment from the courtroom in her head. The judge had taken a short recess after Josh's powerful statement, but no one could predict how long it would take before she made her decision. Every minute felt like an eternity. Sarah wasn't sure if her heart could take the uncertainty much longer. Josh, on the other hand, seemed almost untouched by the chaos around him. After his emotional moment in court, he had retreated back into his routine, still processing everything but doing so in his own quiet way. It was a relief for Sarah to see him so calm, but also a reminder of how strong he had become. She realized that he had already grown up in ways she hadn't fully recognized before. Mark had tried to contact her several times in the days that followed, but Sarah ignored his calls. She knew that he was probably trying to strategize or convince her that they could still come to some sort of arrangement, but Sarah was no longer interested in playing that game. This battle wasn't just about custody anymore. It was about what was best for Josh, and she wasn't going to allow anyone, not even Mark, to disrupt that. Then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Sarah received the call she had been waiting for. It was the judge's office. "Ms. Richards," the clerk's voice was warm but serious. "The judge has made her decision. We're scheduling a hearing tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the ruling." The world felt as if it had stopped spinning for a moment. Tomorrow. It would all come to an end tomorrow. Sarah thanked the clerk, then hung up the phone, her hands trembling. Josh, who had been sitting nearby, looked up at her with an unspoken question in his eyes. "It's tomorrow, Josh," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his face calm but his eyes reflecting the nervous energy that Sarah herself was struggling to contain. The next morning, Sarah and Josh arrived at the courthouse earlier than expected. The parking lot felt empty, the air thick with the anticipation of what was about to happen. As they entered the building, Sarah couldn't help but glance over at the other families in the waiting area, each one with their own story, their own battle. But today, it felt as though the story, her story, was finally nearing its end. They were called into the courtroom shortly after they arrived. Sarah tried to steady her breathing as they made their way to their seats. Josh sat beside her, his hands folded in his lap, but his leg bounced nervously under the table. Sarah reached over, gently placing her hand on his, offering a silent reassurance. Mark was already seated on the opposite side of the room, looking tense and agitated. His lawyer sat beside him, whispering something to him in hushed tones. Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that, after all this time, this moment had arrived. Mark had fought hard to control the narrative, but now it was up to the judge to decide. The courtroom quieted as the judge entered. She was a tall woman, in her mid-50s, with a stern but thoughtful expression. Her presence commanded respect, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. "Ms. Richards, Mr. Richards," the judge began, her voice steady, "I have reviewed all of the evidence, including the testimonies from both parties, as well as the statements provided by Josh." She glanced down at the letter Josh had written, the one that had touched everyone in the room during his testimony. "I have considered your son's wishes, and I have also taken into account the emotional and psychological well-being of both parties involved." Sarah held her breath. This was the moment of truth. After careful consideration, the judge continued, "I have decided that the best interest of Josh is to remain primarily with his mother, Ms. Richards. Therefore, I am granting her primary custody. Mr. Richards will have visitation rights, but full custody will not be awarded at this time." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The weight of the words sunk in, and she felt a rush of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and even a small sense of victory. She looked over at Josh, whose face lit up with an expression that she would never forget. He gave her a small, tentative smile, his eyes brimming with unspoken words. The judge looked at both Sarah and Mark, her tone firm. "I want to remind both parents that this decision is not an easy one, and it's made with Josh's well-being in mind. I encourage you both to work together, for his sake, to maintain a healthy and supportive co-parenting arrangement." Sarah nodded, her chest tightening with both gratitude and trepidation. The battle was over, but the work, perhaps the harder work, was just beginning. As Sarah walked out of the courtroom, her legs felt like jelly. It took everything in her to keep moving, to remain composed. She didn't want to collapse in tears, not now, not in front of everyone. Josh was right beside her, his hand in hers, but even he was quiet. They walked out of the courthouse together, the world outside feeling brighter, almost surreal. When they reached the car, Sarah finally allowed herself to let go. She sat in the driver's seat, tears streaming down her face as she held her son's hand tightly. For so long, she had carried the weight of this battle alone, but now it was over. They had won. "We did it, Josh," she whispered through her tears. "We really did it." Josh looked at her, a proud smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, we did." The drive home was quiet, but Sarah knew that the road ahead was still going to be challenging. Mark wasn't going to give up easily, and there would still be moments of tension, of awkwardness, as they worked out the details of co-parenting. But for now, Sarah allowed herself to believe in the possibility of peace. As they walked into their home, she felt a sense of calm that she hadn't known in a long time. She had fought for Josh. She had fought for their family. And while the journey had been long and fraught with heartache, it had led her to this moment of peace. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself reflecting on everything she had learned. The battle had taken a toll on her, but it had also shown her just how strong she was, how strong they were together. Through the darkest times, love had carried them through. It wasn't always perfect, but it was enough. And in that moment, as she hugged Josh tightly, she knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following the court's ruling felt like a delicate transition, a careful dance of adjustment. Sarah and Josh moved through their new routine, the weight of the custody battle still hanging in the air like a thin fog. For the first time in months, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but it was coupled with the realization that this peace was fragile and still in progress. Mark, as expected, didn't take the decision lightly. His attempts to negotiate for more time with Josh were frequent but subtle. He didn't directly challenge the judge's ruling, but his displeasure was clear. Sarah saw it in his eyes during their conversations, heard it in the way he spoke to Josh, and even in the small, seemingly insignificant comments he would make when they exchanged their son during visitations. Every interaction, no matter how casual, had an undertone of tension. But Sarah had grown stronger through this process, more resolute in her role as Josh's protector. She understood now that while the custody battle had ended in her favor, the journey toward healing and establishing a healthy relationship with Josh wasn't something that would happen overnight. Josh, however, was more resilient than Sarah had expected. His quiet demeanor since the court date seemed to reflect a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He was less anxious, more himself. But Sarah could see there was still a quiet sadness in his eyes, a result of the emotional toll the battle had taken on him. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Josh finally spoke, his voice quiet but certain. "Mom," he began, pushing his food around on his plate, "I'm glad we don't have to go to court anymore. I hate it there." Sarah paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, and looked at him, her heart aching. "I know, sweetheart. I hated it too. But it's over now. We're safe." He nodded, but there was something in his expression that spoke volumes. He wasn't just talking about the court. He was talking about everything that had come before it, the confusion and stress he had felt during the entire process. It was as if he had been holding his breath, waiting for a signal that it was okay to exhale. "I just don't want things to be weird," Josh continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want things to get messed up with Dad and everything. I don't want to hurt him." Sarah's heart broke a little as she heard his words. He was trying so hard to navigate this delicate situation, a child carrying the emotional weight of two adults' decisions. "You don't have to worry about that, Josh," Sarah reassured him, placing her hand over his. "You're not the one making these decisions. All I want is for you to be happy and to feel safe. And that's what matters most." Josh smiled faintly, but still seemed unsure. Sarah could feel the layers of complexity surrounding their situation, and while the ruling had granted her primary custody, the emotional work had only just begun. The following weeks were filled with small, everyday challenges. Sarah tried to make things feel as normal as possible for Josh, planning simple activities and outings to distract from the lingering tension. They spent weekends at the park, baking cookies together, and even started watching old movies they both loved, trying to rebuild a sense of calm in their home. But the awkwardness was still there, especially during the exchanges with Mark. Each handoff felt like an uncomfortable ritual where Sarah could never quite fully relax. There was always the fear that Mark would say or do something to make Josh feel torn between them. On one of these visits, when Josh went to meet his father for a weekend visit, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching them leave. She noticed how tense Josh's shoulders were, how he avoided eye contact with her as he climbed into Mark's car. He was growing up fast, and his internal struggles were becoming more visible. As the car drove away, Sarah closed the door slowly, leaning against it for a moment. She felt a pang of guilt, wondering if she was doing enough to help him through this. Was she being the mother he needed? The next few days were quieter than usual. Sarah buried herself in work, using the distraction to avoid thinking too much about how everything was unfolding. But the silence was unsettling. She hadn't heard from Josh as often as she normally would during these visits, and her thoughts ran wild. Was he okay? Was he happy? Was Mark saying things that were making him feel conflicted again? Finally, after 2 days, Josh came home. He walked in the door with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes a little red and his mood subdued. "Hey, buddy," Sarah greeted him, trying to sound casual despite the knot of worry tightening in her chest. "How was the weekend?" Josh shrugged, his usual energy noticeably absent. "It was fine, I guess. Did you have fun with Dad?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, We went to the lake, like always. But it felt weird. Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. What felt weird, honey? Josh sat down at the kitchen table and sighed. I don't know. It's just, I feel like I'm stuck in the middle of you two. Like, I can't win, you know? No matter what I do, someone's upset. Sarah felt the weight of his words settle deep in her chest. She sat down across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. I know it's hard, Josh. It's hard for both of us. But listen to me, you don't have to worry about making anyone happy. What matters is you. And we're going to get through this together. You don't have to fix anything. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. Josh looked up at her, his expression vulnerable. I just don't want you and Dad to keep fighting. It's like it never ends. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that this conversation was one of many they would have. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. This was the cost of the battle she had fought. But at least now they were together. And that was something. I promise, Josh, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling inside her. I won't let it happen. I'll make sure things don't get worse. And we'll work through this, okay? You and me. Josh nodded, a small, uncertain smile tugging at his lips. He didn't fully believe it yet, but Sarah could see the hope flicker in his eyes. It was a start. It was a rainy afternoon when Sarah found herself sitting across from her lawyer, Rachel, in a small coffee shop just a few blocks from the courthouse. The familiar space, with its low lighting and the soft hum of background chatter, felt surprisingly comforting to Sarah, despite the emotional exhaustion she had been carrying for weeks. Why don't we take a break from the chaos for a minute? Rachel suggested, pushing a steaming cup of tea toward Sarah. You've earned it. Sarah looked down at the cup in her hands. The warmth from the tea was soothing, but the weight of everything, the months of stress, the battles fought in court, and the moments of doubt and fear, still lingered in her mind. It wasn't over, and she knew that. The real challenge had only just begun. Healing, rebuilding, and learning how to coexist with Mark for Josh's sake. Thanks, Sarah said quietly, her voice soft. I don't even know where to start. Everything is still a mess, but now it's just different. Rachel nodded, her expression kind and understanding. It's normal to feel that way after something like this. The relief doesn't always come with a neat bow. There's a lot to process. Sarah looked up at Rachel, her eyes searching the woman's face. Rachel had been more than just a lawyer to Sarah during the custody battle. She had been a sounding board, a pillar of strength, and unexpectedly a friend. The hours they spent preparing for court, strategizing, and even talking about their lives outside the legal realm had forged a bond between them. Can I ask you something, Rachel? Sarah's voice was hesitant. Of course, Rachel replied, settling back into her chair. It's just, you've been so supportive throughout all of this, and I know we've mostly focused on the case and my son, but I've never really asked you much about yourself. About your life. Rachel smiled, a gentle curve of her lips. There's not much to tell, honestly. I'm just a lawyer trying to make a living. But that said, I do think there's something to be said for connecting with the people we help. Sarah felt a pang of gratitude in her chest. It wasn't just the legal advice that had helped Sarah through the hardest moments, but Rachel's kindness and willingness to listen. Sarah's heart had felt lighter every time they sat together, even when the topic was heavy. In a strange way, Rachel had become a friend, someone who was there not just for the case, but for her. I really don't know how I could have gotten through this without you, Sarah admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I think I've been so focused on everything falling apart, I didn't realize I'd built something new in the process. Rachel's eyes softened. Sometimes the most unexpected friendships come from the hardest times. We're all human, after all. And the truth is, Sarah, you did most of the hard work. You stood up for yourself and for Josh. You fought for him when no one else would. The sincerity in Rachel's words hit Sarah harder than she expected. It wasn't just about the custody battle anymore. It was about the personal growth Sarah had gone through, about realizing her strength, her resilience, and her capacity to not just survive, but to thrive in the face of adversity. "I don't know what comes next," Sarah said with a sigh. "I know I've won the custody battle, but there's so much left to rebuild. I have to figure out how to co-parent with Mark, how to make sure Josh feels safe, and how to heal myself too." Rachel reached across the table, her hand resting gently on Sarah's. "You don't have to do it all at once. Life's not a checklist. Take it one day at a time. And remember, healing doesn't happen in a straight line." A sense of comfort washed over Sarah. There, in the small corner of the coffee shop, she realized how far she'd come. The path ahead might still be fraught with challenges, but she wasn't walking it alone. She had built a support system, her family, her friends, and yes, Rachel, people who cared and were willing to help her move forward. "I really appreciate you," Sarah said, her voice earnest. "I'm glad I found you during all this." Rachel smiled warmly, her eyes full of understanding. "I'm glad too. You've been through so much, Sarah. But you're stronger than you realize. You've got this." The next few weeks marked a new chapter in Sarah's life. As she began to adjust to the post-court reality, she also worked on strengthening the relationships around her. With Rachel's support, she slowly let go of the anger and bitterness that had weighed so heavily on her during the custody battle. The process was slow, but Sarah felt the first stirrings of peace within herself. During this time, Sarah also found herself spending more time with her father, who had always been there for her. He'd watched the custody battle unfold with a quiet concern, never pressuring her to make decisions, but always ready to listen. One evening, as Sarah and her father sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, he turned to her, a serious expression on his face. "You've changed, Sarah," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I can see it. You're not the same person who walked into that courtroom months ago. You've become stronger, more confident." Sarah paused, letting his words sink in. "I guess I have. But it's been hard. I've had to make so many tough decisions. I've had to learn how to stand up for myself." Her father nodded. "That's what life does, I suppose. It challenges you. It breaks you down, but it also builds you back up." "I've learned a lot about myself," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And about what matters most." Her father reached over and took her hand. "You've always been strong, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." As Sarah looked out over the backyard, the sun setting on the horizon, she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in months. She had fought for her son. She had faced the hardest battle of her life, and now it was time to begin healing. And she knew, deep down, that even though she wasn't quite sure what the future held, she had the strength to face it. She had everything she needed to rebuild her life: love, resilience, and a circle of people who had her back. A month after the court battle had ended, Sarah and Josh found themselves on a small, tranquil beach in Maine. The wind was soft, and the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore was the only noise that filled the air. It was exactly what Sarah had needed: space to breathe, time to think, and a chance to simply be with her son without the pressures of the past looming over them. Josh was running along the shore, his laughter echoing in the air as he kicked up sand and raced with the wind. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah saw him truly carefree, his smile unburdened by the chaos of the custody battle. She sat on a large rock, watching him with a sense of relief, her heart light. It wasn't just the beauty of the ocean or the crisp, salty air that calmed her. It was the simple joy of being in this moment with Josh. She hadn't realized how much they both needed this time away from everything to reconnect and heal. After all, the past few months had been a whirlwind. They'd been tangled in a never-ending legal process, caught between tension and fear. Now, for the first time, Sarah could exhale. "Mom, come race with me," Josh shouted, his eyes sparkling with excitement. Sarah smiled, standing up from the rock and stretching her legs. "I'm too old to race like that, kiddo." Josh gave her a playful pout, then dashed toward her, pulling her into the sand. "Come on. It's fun." She couldn't resist his enthusiasm. Laughing, she let herself be swept away in the moment, running beside him down the beach. They raced together, their feet kicking up sand, both of them laughing harder than they had in a long time. It felt so natural, so easy. As they reached the edge of the water, Sarah bent down, hands on her knees, breathless from the run. "This was a good idea," she said, still laughing. Josh smiled up at her, a smile that felt genuine and bright. "We should do this more often," he said, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Sarah felt that her son was truly happy, free from the weight of the past. They spent the entire day walking along the shoreline, collecting shells, talking about everything and nothing, and even enjoying a peaceful lunch at a small, rustic beachside cafe. The days that followed were just as calm. They explored the little coastal town, visited quaint shops, and watched the sunset every evening from their cabin by the sea. It was the escape they both needed. But even in the midst of all the beauty and peace, Sarah knew that healing wasn't just about getting away. It was about facing the emotional scars, about allowing herself to process everything that had happened. It was the moments of quiet reflection that forced her to acknowledge the weight of the journey she'd been on. The custody battle had torn her apart, but now she was learning to rebuild herself piece by piece. The morning after their third day in Maine, Sarah and Josh were sitting on the porch, sipping hot cocoa and watching the sun rise over the ocean. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Josh's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Of course," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" His eyes were full of the kind of vulnerability that only a child could possess. There was so much unspoken in that question. He wasn't just asking about their trip or their routine. He was asking about his life, about the constant tension that had marked their home for so long, about his relationship with his dad. Sarah's heart clenched, but she smiled at him, reaching for his hand. "I think we're going to make a new normal," she said softly. "We don't have to go back to the way things were. We can create something better together." Josh seemed to think about this for a moment, his brow furrowed slightly. Then, after a pause, he nodded. "I like that," he said. "I like the idea of something better." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She had come so far, and in this moment, she realized that she had everything she needed to move forward, her son, her strength, and the love that they shared. No matter what the future held, they would face it together, and that gave her more hope than anything. A few weeks later, after returning from Maine, Sarah felt the weight of her next big challenge, rebuilding her life and learning how to coexist with Mark. The healing process wasn't just about her and Josh. It was about learning to navigate the complex waters of co-parenting with her ex-husband. The first few interactions with Mark were awkward, to say the least. They had both been through so much, and it was clear that there was still a lot of emotional baggage between them. Sarah didn't expect it to be easy, but she had to try for Josh's sake. After all, Josh loved his father, despite everything that had happened. She could see that he was still trying to reconcile his feelings, torn between the two people he loved most. Sarah made a conscious effort to keep things civil. When Mark arrived to pick up Josh for their weekend visit, she greeted him politely, though she could feel the tension between them. "Hey, Mark," she said, trying to sound casual. "Josh has been looking forward to the weekend with you." Mark gave her a stiff nod, though his eyes were colder than she remembered. "Yeah, we've got some plans," he said, his voice tight. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope you both have a good time." As Josh grabbed his bag and headed toward the door, he stopped, turning back to Sarah with a smile. "I'll see you on Sunday, Mom." "Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart," Sarah said, watching him leave. As the door closed behind them, Sarah let out a deep breath, her shoulders sagging. The reality of co-parenting was sinking in, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. But she also knew it was necessary. Healing would take time, not just for her, but for everyone involved. But she was ready. She had to be. Sarah felt the change in the air the moment Mark arrived for his next scheduled visitation with Josh. There was something colder about him now, something less controlled. His movements were stiff, his eyes sharp. She could tell that beneath the surface, he was still angry, even though he didn't express it directly. It wasn't just about the custody ruling anymore, it was deeper. It was a quiet rage that festered, simmering beneath his surface. As Sarah stood in the doorway, watching Josh gather his things, she tried to ignore the familiar sense of unease that tightened her chest. For so long, she had done her best to remain calm, but something about Mark's presence was unsettling now. The judgment was still fresh, and the bitterness from the court battle still lingered like an unspoken tension between them. "Ready, kiddo?" Mark's voice cut through the quiet. Josh nodded and smiled at his father, but Sarah saw the wariness in his eyes. She knew that Josh was still trying to make sense of everything that had happened, still struggling to balance his love for both parents against the emotional toll of the past months. He was only 10, and yet he had already witnessed so much. "Have a good time, Josh," Sarah said softly, keeping her tone neutral. She didn't want to show any sign of weakness in front of Mark, but she couldn't help the unease that crept in. Josh paused, his small face filled with the kind of uncertainty Sarah had been seeing more and more of lately. He walked over to Sarah and gave her a hug. "Love you, Mom. See you Sunday." "Love you too, sweetheart." "Be good," she said, hugging him tightly, feeling the small weight of his body against hers. Mark cleared his throat, his arms crossed over his chest, clearly not pleased with how long the interaction was taking. Sarah could feel his eyes on her, but she kept her focus on Josh as he pulled away and walked toward the door. "Let's go, Josh." "We don't have all day," Mark said, his voice low and stern. Josh nodded and quickly followed his father out the door, leaving Sarah standing there, feeling the ache in her heart. She didn't let herself break down in front of Mark. She had too much pride for that, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. But it didn't make the feeling of loss any less painful. As she closed the door behind them, Sarah stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle in. She knew this wasn't over. Mark's anger wasn't something she could easily dismiss. She just didn't know how deep it ran or what he might do next. The days that followed were marked by an eerie calm. Sarah focused on her work and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for herself and Josh. She continued to reach out to friends and family, keeping herself grounded, but a sense of unease lingered in the back of her mind. Mark's anger had only intensified since the court ruling. The tension between them, though not openly confrontational, had become palpable. Every interaction was strained, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Rachel, who had been her constant support throughout the custody battle. "Hey, Sarah," Rachel said, her voice laced with concern. "I just heard from someone. Mark's been telling people he's planning something big." Sarah felt her stomach drop at the mention of Mark's name. "What do you mean, something big?" Rachel hesitated before continuing, her tone cautious. "I don't know the details, but it sounds like he's planning something that could hurt you, or maybe Josh. He's been talking to people who are close to him, and he's been acting, well, a little off lately. Almost like he's still not over the custody loss." Sarah's mind raced as she processed Rachel's words. The idea that Mark might try to get back at her in some way, either through the legal system or by manipulating others, didn't surprise her. He had always been someone who had to win, someone who couldn't accept defeat. "Thanks for letting me know, Rachel," Sarah said, though her voice was shaky. "I'll keep my guard up." "Just be careful, Sarah," Rachel urged. "I don't trust him, and you shouldn't either." The conversation ended, but the unease Sarah felt grew even more intense. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark's anger wasn't just directed at her anymore. He was hurt, and when Mark got hurt, people around him often suffered. Later that evening, as Sarah was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen, seeing that it was a text from Mark. "I want to talk. Meet me tomorrow at the park. 10 a.m. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he wanted to talk about, but she knew that she had to go. This could be important, and as much as she hated to admit it, she couldn't ignore him. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the park, her nerves on edge. She parked her car and walked along the path leading to the playground, where she saw Mark sitting on a bench, his face unreadable. He was staring straight ahead, not looking at her as she approached. "Mark," Sarah said cautiously, trying to gauge his mood. Mark looked up, his expression hardening when he saw her. "We need to talk about Josh," he said coldly. "Josh is fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "He's happy. He's safe." Mark's jaw tightened. "It's not about that. It's about you, Sarah. You think you've won, but this isn't over. You'll see. I'll make sure of it." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she heard his words. She had known he wouldn't let go easily, but the venom in his voice sent a surge of fear through her. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let her guard down. She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "What are you threatening now, Mark? This has to stop." He leaned forward, his tone cold and menacing. "You'll regret this, Sarah. You've pushed me too far." The silence between them felt suffocating. Sarah stood her ground, refusing to back down. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her any longer. She had fought too hard to protect Josh, and she wasn't going to let Mark's anger dictate their lives anymore. "I'll protect my son no matter what," Sarah said, her voice firm. Mark stood up abruptly, his hands clenched at his sides. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the park, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what Mark was planning, but she knew that the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Sarah had always known that co-parenting with Mark would never be easy, but she didn't realize just how difficult it would be. After the court battle, she had hoped things would calm down, that they would find a way to work together for Josh's sake. But each visit, each interaction with Mark, was like stepping onto fragile ground. One wrong move, and it could all crack. It was the first weekend after the custody decision, and Mark was due to pick up Josh for his weekend visit. Sarah had told herself she would try to make this work. She would smile, keep it civil, and let Josh have the time with his father that he needed. But as she heard Mark's car pull into the driveway, a wave of dread washed over her. The thought of him stepping into her life, even for a few hours, filled her with unease. She couldn't forget the cold look he had given her during their last conversation in the park. The tension in his eyes had been sharp, and his words hung in the air, lingering like a dark cloud. "Josh," she called from the living room, trying to keep her voice steady. "Your dad's here." Josh appeared in the hallway, his expression a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. His love for Mark was obvious, but so was his need for stability, something that had been sorely lacking in the past few months. He had taken it hard when Mark's custody fight turned so bitter, and though he tried to keep up appearances, Sarah could tell her son was still struggling. "Are you ready to go, buddy?" she asked, kneeling down to meet Josh at eye level. Josh nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, Mom. I'll be back on Sunday, right?" "Of course," Sarah said, brushing a strand of hair out of his eyes. "Have a good time, and I'll see you then." Mark knocked on the doorframe, breaking the moment between mother and son. His gaze was cool, distant. "Can we go now?" Sarah stood up, swallowing the frustration rising in her chest. She nodded and stepped aside. "It's all yours." She watched as Josh left the house with Mark, trying to make the best of the situation. Josh had become so used to the alternating weekends with his father, but Sarah could see how much the custody battle had affected him. He had grown quieter, more reserved. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he was just pretending to be fine or if the strain was becoming too much for him. She closed the door softly, turning to look around the empty house. The silence felt heavy, like a weight she couldn't shake off. She hadn't expected it to be this hard. She hadn't expected Mark to still hold so much power over her emotions, despite everything they had been through. But as she sat in the quiet, she realized that this was what co-parenting would look like: awkward interactions, uncomfortable silences, and the constant push and pull between doing what was best for Josh and trying to maintain some semblance of peace. The next week brought with it a new set of challenges. Sarah and Mark had agreed to meet to discuss the logistics of their co-parenting arrangement, but Sarah wasn't sure what to expect. Mark hadn't made any effort to soften the tension between them. In fact, he had barely spoken to her since their last interaction at the park. He was still holding on to that resentment, and Sarah didn't know how to break through it. They agreed to meet at a local cafe, neutral ground, away from the tension of their respective homes. When Sarah arrived, Mark was already sitting at a table, his arms crossed over his chest. His posture was rigid, like a fortress, and Sarah instantly felt the familiar discomfort settling in. "Mark," she greeted him coolly as she took a seat across from him. "What's on your mind?" Mark didn't waste any time. "I think we need to figure this out once and for all," he said, his voice clipped. "It's not just about Josh's schedule anymore. It's about how things are going to be between us from here on out. You can't keep treating me like I'm the enemy." Sarah's heart clenched. "I'm not treating you like the enemy, Mark. But you have to understand that this is a huge change for Josh. He's not the only one who's affected here." Mark shot her a sharp look. "You think I don't know that?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping low. "But I'm his father. And I'm not going to let you push me out of his life just because you think I'm the bad guy." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm not trying to push you out, Mark. I'm just trying to make sure that Josh feels stable, that he feels safe. We both need to respect that." Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "You always did have a way of turning everything into a mom issue. I'm just as capable of being a parent as you are." "I never said you weren't," Sarah replied firmly. "But you can't keep using Josh as a weapon in some personal vendetta against me. He's not a pawn." There was a long pause. Mark stared at her, his jaw tight. Sarah could see that he was trying to suppress the anger bubbling inside of him, but it was clear he was struggling. "I never wanted it to be like this," Mark muttered, his voice quieter now. "I never wanted to fight you like this, Sarah." But everything changed after the custody battle. Sarah softened a little, but she didn't let her guard down completely. She had to be careful, she reminded herself. "I know it wasn't easy for you. But fighting for control is not going to help Josh. He needs both of us, not just a tug-of-war." Mark looked away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Sarah wasn't sure if he was even listening, but when he finally spoke again, his tone was different. "I know," he said quietly. I didn't know how else to handle it. I felt like I was losing him. Like I was losing everything." Sarah nodded slowly. She understood that feeling, that fear of losing someone you love. But she also knew that they couldn't keep holding on to that fear forever. It would only hurt Josh in the end. "We'll figure it out," she said, offering him a tentative smile. "One day at a time." Mark gave a stiff nod, his expression still distant. But for the first time in a long while, Sarah thought she might have caught a glimpse of the man she used to know underneath the layers of anger and resentment. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they continued to discuss the logistics of co-parenting, Sarah couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for them yet. There was no way to undo the past, but perhaps they could both start learning how to move forward, for Josh's sake. Sarah hadn't anticipated that, a year after the custody battle, she'd find herself surrounded by a support system she hadn't known she needed. The moments that had once felt isolating were now peppered with unexpected acts of kindness and understanding, mostly from those she least expected it. It had started with Rachel, her best friend, who had been her rock throughout the entire custody battle. Rachel had never been a fan of Mark, but her support for Sarah was unwavering. But it wasn't just Rachel. Her father, Peter, had been quietly stepping in, offering both emotional and physical support in ways Sarah hadn't fully appreciated before. The first time her father had offered to help with Josh, Sarah hadn't taken it seriously. She didn't want to burden him, not after everything he'd been through in his own life. But when he showed up one Saturday morning, a bag of groceries in hand, Sarah realized just how much he wanted to be there for her. "Hey, kiddo," her father greeted her with a smile that, despite its warmth, always carried a trace of sadness. "I thought I'd stop by and help out with the weekend chores." Sarah laughed, though it felt a little forced. "Dad, you don't need to do that. I'm fine." He shook his head, his graying hair catching the light. "Don't argue with me. I've seen the way you've been running yourself ragged. You deserve a break." As he settled into her kitchen and started unpacking the groceries, Sarah's eyes welled up without warning. She quickly turned away, trying to hide the tears that threatened to escape. It wasn't just the kindness, it was the overwhelming sense that, despite everything, she wasn't alone. It was the realization that there were people who cared about her, who saw what she was going through, and who wanted to lighten the load. It wasn't just the grand gestures, but the small things, the little moments that were filling the gaps in her heart. Peter caught her wiping her eyes and walked over to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Hey, I know it's been hard, but I'm here, and you don't have to do it all on your own. You never have to." Sarah's breath caught, and she nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Thank you, Dad. I really needed this." The unexpected support didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, Rachel and Peter both continued to check in, offering help in various ways. Rachel offered to take Josh out for ice cream or to a movie whenever Sarah needed some alone time. Peter, a retired teacher, began tutoring Josh once a week, helping him stay on track with his schoolwork while giving Sarah a few hours of peace. Through all of this, Sarah was slowly learning how to accept help. It wasn't easy for her. She had spent so many years trying to do everything on her own, trying to keep things together despite the chaos, but as the days went by, she began to realize that letting people in wasn't a sign of weakness. It was, in fact, a powerful act of strength. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table after dinner, Sarah glanced across the room at Josh, who was engrossed in his schoolwork. His smile had returned, the spark in his eyes that had been dimmed for so long now shining brightly once again. She knew that his newfound confidence had a lot to do with the support system that had surrounded them both in recent months. In the quiet moments between school and bedtime, Sarah began to feel a peace she hadn't known in years. There were still rough days when she felt like she was walking on eggshells around Mark, days when the emotional scars from the custody battle still stung, but more often than not, she felt a sense of gratitude. Rachel had been right. She wasn't in this alone. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah found herself at the cafe where she and Mark had had their first post-custody meeting. It had become her quiet place, her little retreat where she could sip coffee and collect her thoughts. Today, Rachel was meeting her there for a catch-up session. When Rachel arrived, she slid into the chair across from Sarah, her warm smile lighting up the dimly lit cafe. "So, how's everything going?" she asked, immediately cutting to the chase. Sarah sighed and stirred her coffee slowly, the steam rising in delicate swirls. "It's going. I don't know. It's just complicated. I mean, the co-parenting is better. We're not at each other's throats anymore, but it's still tense. I just don't know what to expect with Mark anymore." Rachel nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I get it. But you've come so far. Look at where you were a year ago." Sarah smiled faintly, remembering the raw emotions that had flooded her when she first learned about the custody battle. The fear, the anger, the uncertainty. She had been so consumed by the battle that she hadn't seen a way out. But now, things were different. "I know," Sarah said, her voice quieter now. Sometimes I feel like I'm still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like any minute now, something's going to go wrong." Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand over Sarah's. "You don't have to wait for something to go wrong, Sarah. It's okay to believe that things can stay good. It's okay to trust that things are going to be okay." Sarah looked at her best friend, her heart swelling with gratitude. Rachel had always been the voice of reason, the one who saw the world through a lens of optimism. And for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a flicker of hope that maybe things would stay good. "Thanks, Rach," Sarah said, squeezing her hand in return. "I think I'm finally starting to believe that." As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that she had been focusing too much on the fear of what could go wrong. She had been so preoccupied with the past and the battles she'd fought that she hadn't given herself the space to appreciate the present moment. Things weren't perfect, and they might never be. But she was learning to find peace in the small victories, like seeing Josh thrive, watching her relationship with her father grow stronger, and cherishing the support of friends who had never let her go. Slowly but surely, Sarah was beginning to see that she had built something far more important than just a peaceful home. She had built a community, a family that extended beyond blood. And that, she realized, was enough. The weeks following the custody battle had brought with them a calm Sarah hadn't expected. While the tension between her and Mark lingered, there was a new understanding between them, though frail, it was there. Co-parenting, though still awkward at times, had become a reality they both had to face. Sarah had adjusted to the idea that Mark would always be a part of her life in some way because of Josh, but she had also learned to keep her boundaries strong. But it was in the quieter moments that Sarah began to notice something she hadn't expected. Mark seemed different. There was a subtle shift in the way he interacted with her, a quiet vulnerability that had never been there before. And it had started to show in the way he interacted with Josh. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah was tidying up the living room when Josh ran into the room, his face lit with excitement. "Mom, Dad wants to take me to the park today. Just me and him." The words caught Sarah off guard, and she paused, staring at Josh with a mixture of confusion and caution. Mark had taken Josh to the park before, but it had been under duress, or as part of their court-ordered time. This invitation felt different. It felt more genuine. "Really?" Sarah asked, a tightness in her chest she hadn't expected. She fought to keep her tone neutral. "I thought you guys were meeting on Sunday for your visit." Josh nodded, bouncing on his feet. "Yeah, but he said he wanted to spend some time with me today." He sounded, I dunno, like he missed me. His eyes searched hers, unsure of how she'd react. Sarah blinked, the words catching her off guard. "Well, that's great, sweetheart. I'm glad he wants to spend time with you." She gave him a soft smile, though inside she was still processing the unexpectedness of it all. As Josh excitedly rushed to get ready, Sarah stood in the middle of the room, her thoughts swirling. She had been expecting Mark to remain distant, to treat their co-parenting as nothing more than a necessary obligation. But this felt different. Mark had always been a man of control, of manipulation, and now this? It was almost as if he was trying to make amends. But why? Was it genuine? Or was it just another phase in his complex mind games? Later that afternoon, Sarah got a call from Rachel. Her best friend had been keeping tabs on Mark's behavior, and after Sarah had described Josh's plans for the park, Rachel was just as puzzled. "I don't know, Sarah. Something feels off about it. You need to keep your guard up, okay? I know it's easy to hope for a change in him, but you've seen the worst side of him." "I know," Sarah replied, rubbing her temple. He sounded different, Rachel. And Josh seems so excited. I don't know if it's just because I want to believe it's real, I don't know. Rachel sighed, her voice gentle but firm. It's okay to want him to change. But don't let your guard down completely. I know how much you want Josh to have a healthy relationship with his father. But don't let Mark's possible regret cloud your judgment. We've been through too much already. I know, Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. It's just hard, you know? To always have that fear lurking. I don't know how to navigate this anymore. Rachel's response was soft, but filled with a sense of solidarity. You don't have to navigate it alone, Sarah. You've got people who love you, who will help you figure it out. We've got your back. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself feeling torn. She wanted to believe that Mark was changing, but the part of her that had lived through his manipulation, his cruelty, couldn't let go of the fear that this was just another act in his game. And for Josh's sake, she had to walk a fine line between hope and caution. Later that evening, when Josh returned from the park, he was beaming. His energy was infectious, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah saw a real joy in her son's eyes. He'd been through so much during the past year, but today, there was a carefree energy about him that hadn't been there before. Mom, it was awesome, Josh exclaimed, tossing his jacket on the couch. Dad and I played basketball. He taught me how to make a proper shot, and we even went for ice cream afterward. It was just so much fun. He actually talked to me about stuff, you know? Like real stuff. Not just the usual stuff. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she took a moment to process what Josh was saying. That sounds great, buddy. I'm glad you had a good time. Josh's eyes softened as he looked at her, his expression full of hope. He told me he's sorry for not being around more. He said he missed me, and he wants to be a better dad. I think he means it, Mom. A lump formed in Sarah's throat, and she tried to steady her voice. I'm glad he said that to you, Josh. I really am. Josh, sensing his mother's hesitation, continued, I know things haven't been easy, but I think he's really trying, Mom. I think maybe he really wants to be part of my life again. Sarah nodded slowly, her emotions a swirling mixture of uncertainty and cautious optimism. She knew this was a breakthrough for Josh, a sign that he was healing. But she also knew better than to let her guard down entirely. That night, after Josh had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the day's events. Mark's regret, whether sincere or not, had clearly left an impact on Josh. She had to admit that she hadn't expected this shift, but she wasn't sure what it meant for their future. Had Mark finally come to terms with his actions, or was this just another manipulation in a long line of them? As Sarah mulled over her thoughts, the phone rang. It was Mark. She hesitated for a moment, then answered. Hello, she said, keeping her tone neutral. Hey, Mark's voice was softer than usual. I just wanted to check in and see how Josh is doing. He's fine, Sarah replied, the tightness in her chest returning. He had a good time today. Thank you for taking him to the park. Mark paused, then spoke again, quieter now. I know I've been difficult, Sarah. I've made mistakes. But I'm trying. I want to be there for him, for both of you. I need you to know that. Sarah felt a mixture of emotions rush through her. Mark, I don't know what to say. I hear what you're saying, but it's going to take time. Trust takes time. He sighed, the sound low and filled with regret. I get it. I just want you to know that I'm not trying to control things anymore. I just want to be a better father to Josh. Sarah's heart was heavy, torn between hope and caution. She didn't know if this was a genuine change or just another phase of manipulation. But for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Mark's regret was real. But she also knew that time would reveal the truth. The weeks following Mark's unexpected shift in behavior were a blur for Sarah. While the tension between her and Mark had not entirely dissipated, there was a new sense of stability that had emerged, mostly because Josh was adjusting in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. The bond between mother and son had grown even stronger. Sarah had watched her son slowly regain his sense of joy, his energy lifting with every passing day. He no longer walked with the heavy burden of uncertainty that had weighed on him for so long. The joy he'd felt with Mark that day at the park seemed to linger, and Josh spoke of their time together often, almost as if he were testing the waters, waiting to see if it was real, if this change would last. As the days passed, Sarah was increasingly amazed by Josh's growing maturity. He was no longer just her little boy who needed constant reassurance. He was beginning to express himself more clearly, to understand the weight of everything they had been through, and to take ownership of his emotions. One evening, after dinner, Sarah and Josh were sitting together on the couch, watching an old family movie. Josh had become more comfortable sharing his feelings with her, no longer afraid of voicing his worries or dreams. Sarah had seen this transition before her eyes. Her once quiet son, the one who had retreated into himself during the hardest days of the custody battle, was now speaking openly. "Mom," Josh said, his voice tentative. "I've been thinking about something." Sarah paused the movie and turned to him, her gaze softening. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" Josh fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, then looked up at her. I think I'm starting to understand what you went through. You know, during the whole thing with Dad." A lump formed in Sarah's throat, and she took a deep breath, encouraging him with a gentle smile. "I'm glad you're starting to understand, Josh. I know it was hard for you." Josh's eyes searched hers, a look of vulnerability on his face. "It wasn't just hard for me, was it? It was hard for you too, right?" Sarah's heart swelled at his words. He wasn't just understanding the pain from his perspective. He was beginning to grasp the bigger picture, the emotional toll it had taken on both of them. "Yes, it was," she replied softly. "But we got through it together, didn't we?" Josh nodded slowly. "Yeah, we did. And you know what? I think you're the strongest person I know. I don't know how you did it." The words hit Sarah like a wave. For so long, she had felt like she was barely keeping it together. There were countless moments when she had doubted herself, when she had felt like giving up. But hearing those words from Josh, feeling his admiration for her resilience, it reminded her why she had fought so hard. "Thank you, Josh," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've been so strong too. And I'm really proud of you." Josh smiled at her, the first real smile Sarah had seen from him in a long time. It was a smile of relief, of healing. "I'm just glad everything's starting to feel normal again," Josh said, his words sincere. It was in this moment that Sarah realized how far they had both come. The battle for custody had been harrowing, but in the end, it had forged an even deeper connection between them. They had become a team, mother and son, survivors of a storm that had threatened to tear them apart, but instead had only made them stronger. The next few days were filled with moments that reinforced this newfound bond. Sarah and Josh spent more time together, whether it was taking walks around the neighborhood, sharing stories over dinner, or simply sitting together in comfortable silence. There was an ease between them now, a sense of normalcy they hadn't had in a long time. But Sarah also noticed something else. Josh was opening up in ways he hadn't before. He no longer hesitated to talk about his feelings or his fears. The past seemed to no longer haunt him in the same way, and Sarah knew it had a lot to do with the shifts that were happening in his relationship with Mark. Josh had started confiding in Sarah about his time with Mark, and while Sarah was still cautious about trusting Mark entirely, she couldn't deny the fact that Josh seemed genuinely happy during his visits. Mark had made an effort to spend quality time with Josh, and while it wasn't always perfect, it was clear that he was trying to be a better father. One evening, after a particularly fun day at the park, Josh had come home bubbling with excitement. He couldn't stop talking about his day with Mark, how they had gone on a bike ride, how they had shared a burger at their favorite diner, how Mark had promised they'd do it again next weekend. "I think he's really trying now, Mom," Josh said, his eyes wide with hope. "It's like he really cares. Like he's trying to fix things between us." Sarah didn't know what to say at first. She wanted to believe Josh's words, but the mother in her wanted to protect him, to shield him from any more hurt. She could tell that Josh was trying to navigate the complexity of his relationship with his father, and she wanted to support him, but she couldn't ignore the fear that lurked in the back of her mind. "I think he is trying, Josh," she said carefully, her voice soft but firm. "But remember, actions speak louder than words. Let's see how things go, okay?" Josh nodded, though his smile didn't fade. "Yeah, I get it. But I think it's going to be different this time, Mom. I really do." Sarah's heart swelled with pride as she hugged her son tightly. "I hope so, buddy. I really do." As the days turned into weeks, Sarah watched as Josh continued to grow. He was becoming more confident, more independent, and more comfortable with the idea of having both parents in his life, even if it was in a new, more complicated way. His relationship with Mark was still in its infancy, but it was clear that they were slowly building something new, something that might eventually be stronger than before. And as for Sarah, she couldn't help but feel grateful. The journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, there always would be, but for now, Sarah allowed herself to bask in the quiet, healing moments that she and Josh were building together. They were a family, imperfect, yes, but resilient in the face of everything that had come their way. And with time, Sarah knew they would continue to grow, both as individuals and as mother and son. For the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful about the future. It had been a few months since the custody battle ended, and Sarah had seen both the best and worst of Mark. In the beginning, his resentment was palpable. He would show up to visit Josh with an edge to his demeanor, as though he were still angry at the world, at Sarah, and maybe even at himself. But slowly, something had shifted in him. Mark had begun reaching out more often, not just to Josh, but to Sarah as well. It was subtle at first, a text here or there, asking about Josh's schedule or if they needed anything. Sarah had initially ignored these attempts, unsure of his sincerity, but as the weeks went by, she couldn't help but notice a difference. He was showing up on time for visits. He was bringing Josh little gifts, just small things, like his favorite snacks or a book he thought Josh might like. For the first time since the divorce, Mark seemed to be acting like a father. One evening, after Josh had gone to bed, Sarah received a message from Mark. Her stomach tightened with apprehension. She hadn't heard from him for a few days, and his messages always seemed to come at the most unexpected times. "Can we talk?" the message read. Sarah stared at the phone for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She had no desire to rehash old wounds, but a part of her was curious. What had changed in him? After everything that had happened, could Mark really be different? Reluctantly, she responded, "Sure. What about?" Within minutes, Mark called her. His voice sounded calmer than it had in a long time. "Hey, Sarah. I don't know if you've noticed, but things have been different between us lately, and I wanted to talk to you about it." Sarah hesitated before replying, trying to gauge where he was going with this. "Different how?" Mark sighed. "Look, I know I wasn't the best father during the divorce. And I know I messed up a lot. I've been thinking about everything, and honestly, I didn't handle things well. I've been trying to fix things with Josh, but I know I've got a long way to go. And I don't want to mess it up anymore." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was the first time Mark had ever admitted fault. The first time he had truly acknowledged how much damage he had caused, not just to their relationship, but to Josh's well-being as well. "Mark," Sarah said slowly, "I appreciate you saying that. I really do. But you have to understand that trust takes time. It's not something I can just hand back to you. Not yet." "I know," he replied quickly, his voice sincere. "I'm not asking for that right now. I want to be better. I want to be the father Josh deserves. And I don't want to keep pretending like everything is fine when I know it's not." The vulnerability in his words was unexpected, and for a moment, Sarah felt herself soften. She didn't want to, not completely, but the shift in Mark's tone was undeniable. For the first time in a long time, she heard the man she had once loved, the man who had fought so hard for their family, beneath the anger and pride that had clouded his judgment. "Mark, I'm glad you're realizing this," she said carefully. "But remember, it's not just about saying the right things. It's about showing it. Josh needs to see that you mean it, and right now, he's still processing everything." "I get that. I'm not asking for anything from you," Mark said softly. "But I want to be the father he deserves. I want him to know that I'm here for him. And I'll prove it, slowly, however long it takes." Sarah sat back in her chair, processing his words. It wasn't easy to trust him again, and she knew that. But she also recognized that Mark was trying. He wasn't perfect, and maybe he never would be. But he was finally seeing the bigger picture, the toll his actions had taken on their son, and the toll they had taken on his own ability to be a good father. "I'll hold you to that," Sarah said quietly. "I know. And I'll earn it." After a long pause, Sarah added, "Just be patient with him, okay? With Josh. He's been through a lot. It's going to take time for him to fully trust you again." "I understand," Mark replied, his voice steady. "And I'll be patient." For him, the next few weeks were filled with small, positive changes. Mark was consistent with his visits, showing up early, staying for the full amount of time, and participating in activities that Josh enjoyed. He no longer seemed preoccupied with winning Josh's affection. Instead, he focused on being present, being there for Josh in a way that Sarah had never thought possible during their marriage. One Saturday afternoon, Josh came home from a visit with Mark looking especially animated. He had a wide grin on his face as he bounded into the house. "Mom, guess what?" Josh exclaimed, practically jumping up and down. "Dad and I went to see a baseball game today. It was awesome. He even let me try one of his nachos." Sarah smiled at the enthusiasm in his voice. She could tell he was excited, and she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, Mark was on the right track. "That's great, Josh," she said, her heart swelling with pride for her son. "Did you have fun?" Josh nodded eagerly. "Yeah, we did. It felt normal, you know? Like how it used to be." The word normal struck a chord with Sarah. It had been a long time since their lives felt anything close to normal, but in this moment, she realized that both she and Josh were starting to find their way back. As for Mark, Sarah still didn't fully trust him. She wasn't sure if the changes he was making were permanent or just temporary. But one thing was clear: he was trying. And in the world of co-parenting, that was more than she had ever expected. The tension that once filled Sarah's home, like an invisible storm cloud, began to dissipate. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had softened, like the dull ache of a bruise slowly healing. The process was slow, and for a long time, Sarah wasn't sure if things would ever feel truly normal again. But after everything, the custody battle, the heartache, the pain, Sarah finally found a place of peace, one that she never imagined she would get to. Josh had been thriving. The changes in Mark had made a real difference in their son's life. Sarah could see it in his laughter, his new sense of security, and the way he opened up to her more each day. And for the first time in years, she felt like the weight of the world had lifted off her shoulders. She could focus on moving forward, not just surviving. One afternoon, Sarah and Josh sat at the kitchen table, going over Josh's schoolwork. It was a routine they'd fallen into after school, a comforting time for them to talk, share small jokes, and keep up with homework. "Mom, I think I might try out for the school play," Josh said suddenly, pushing his math problems aside. "Really?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Josh was a natural athlete, always more interested in sports, but this was new. "What's the play?" "It's Peter Pan," Josh said, his face lighting up. "I want to be Peter." Sarah smiled at his enthusiasm. "You'd be great at it. I bet you'd make a perfect Peter Pan." "I think so too." Josh laughed, his usual confidence shining through. I want to try something different. I think I'd like to be in the spotlight for once. Sarah's heart warmed at the sight of him. He was growing up in ways she hadn't anticipated so soon. She could see the new self-assurance that Mark's improving relationship with him had cultivated. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt hope for Josh's future, hope that he was going to be okay, despite everything they had been through. As she watched him, Sarah felt a sense of pride. The child she had fought so hard to protect was blossoming into someone strong and capable, with the courage to chase his dreams, no matter how big they seemed. That evening, Sarah sat alone in the living room, reflecting on everything that had changed. For months, she had been consumed with worry over Josh's emotional state, worry about how to navigate co-parenting, worry about whether Mark would ever change. But now, she found herself at a new crossroads. The custody battle had left its scars, but it had also given Sarah a strength she never knew she had. She'd come a long way since the days of feeling trapped and powerless. There were days when she still felt the lingering effects of everything that had happened, but those days were fewer and further between. The future, while still uncertain, didn't seem as frightening anymore. Mark, for his part, was still working through his own journey. The changes in him had been gradual but real, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the small steps he was taking. He was more present for Josh, and though there were still moments when Sarah couldn't fully trust him, she appreciated that he was at least trying. They were learning to communicate, learning to coexist in a way that was healthy for their son. Josh had started to open up more, talking about his feelings, his fears, his hopes. He was slowly finding his own voice again, one that had been buried beneath the weight of the custody battle for so long. One evening, after Josh had gone to bed, Sarah sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the blank page of a journal she had recently started. She didn't often make time for herself, but something told her that now was the time. She needed to capture this moment, this shift in her life, before it slipped away like so many others. "This is it," she wrote. "A new chapter. The pain is still there, but I'm not afraid anymore. I've learned how strong I can be, how much love can heal, and how much I'm willing to fight for what's right for my son." As Sarah finished writing, she felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had done it. They had made it through. Despite the dark moments, despite the pain and the uncertainty, they had reached the other side. And now she was ready to embrace whatever came next, with a heart full of hope for both herself and for Josh. The following Saturday, Mark came over to pick up Josh for their usual weekend visit. This time, there was no awkwardness in the air. Sarah noticed that the tension between them had lifted, replaced by a tentative but real civility. He greeted her with a polite smile and a nod, then looked at Josh, who was already grabbing his jacket. "Hey, bud, you ready for our trip to the zoo?" Mark asked, his tone warm, genuine. Josh grinned and nodded, running up to give his father a quick hug. "I've been waiting all week for this." As Mark and Josh left, Sarah watched them from the window. She didn't know how long the changes would last or if they would continue, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe. Things weren't perfect. There would always be bumps in the road, but they were moving in the right direction. Josh was happy. Sarah was finding peace. And Mark, despite his flaws, was trying. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real, and it was enough. For Sarah, that was the most important thing. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?